All right, chapter 19, drifting toward disunion. That's an understatement at this point in history. The Civil War is quickly coming upon us as we move forward here. So the title here of this slide is Literary Incendiaries. An incendiary is a fire starter. So these two books went a long way in creating agitation that led to the Civil War. One of them, Uncle Tom's Cabin, we've talked about before. We'll get in a little bit more depth and detail now. And then also another book by a man by the name of Hinton Helper, and it was called The Impending Crisis of the South. And in this book, Helper tried to prove that non-slaveholding Southern whites were really the ones most hurt by slavery, and reason being is because of the economics of slavery that drove down wages. Um, yeah, but you can't even compare the two when it comes to the effect that these two books had on history. I've oftentimes said that Uncle Tom's Cabin is the second most influential book in world history behind the Bible. I mean, that's how big this book was. It was written by a woman by the name of Harriet Beecher Stowe. And actually, Harriet Beecher Stowe had never seen slavery personally. She grew up in the North, and but she did. I believe it was Ohio, and she had interviewed runaway slaves that had got up to the North via the Underground Railroad, and then she put it all together in an amazing book. Um, this book became a huge political force, no doubt about it. It really exposed slavery for what it was. The overall theme of this book is the breakup of slave families. Uncle Tom was a slave who lived on a plantation with his family, and they broke up the family, and it's the story of that and how Uncle Tom was taken away from his family cruelly. And people read this; it brought them to tears. It was written in many different languages, millions and millions and millions of copies sold worldwide. Many people in the North, believe it or not, hard for us to imagine this, didn't even know slavery was going on until they read Uncle Tom's Cabin. So in this day and age of social media, and we know what's happening worldwide within minutes if something big happens, back then they didn't even know slavery was going on. So anyways, reading this book was huge. And they say that Uncle Tom's Cabin not only helped start the Civil War, but also win the Civil War. And what they mean by that is there were many Northerners who read this book and were inspired to go fight a 4.5 year war to its bloody end because of what they read. That's how powerful this book was. I'm a huge believer that books are powerful, but back then, when there's no TV and no internet, books were really powerful, really powerful. So yeah, and Abraham Lincoln once met Harriet Beecher Stowe and said it's a pleasure to meet the little lady who started this great war. Great meaning huge war. So he gives her credit for starting the war, not blame, but credit, because of her incendiary fire starting book, Uncle Tom's Cabin. So very big overall. Okay, so the last chapter we talked about the Kansas-Nebraska Act. And Kansas was designated officially as territory. And the slave issue was going to be decided by popular sovereignty. So the people were going to vote on whether or not Kansas was going to become a free state or free territory or slave territory. And eventually, if they did become, let's say, a slave territory like the South wanted, then when they do enter the Union, they would become a slave state. And as we've talked about here in the last couple of chapters, is that that's what the South wanted more than anything. After the Compromise of 1850, the South was desperate to gain another state so they could equal the free states. There were 31 states at the time. They want 32, and they want that 32nd state to be slave to even things out in the Senate so they could block any legislation that would outlaw slavery. So what happened is many Southerners rushed into Kansas to influence the vote. Many Northerners rushed in to influence the vote. However, in a topic like this, probably the South was going to have more people that were going to go in there. I think they have the most, they feel like they have the most to gain if Kansas territory was turned slave. So they had, were the ones that grabbed hold of the seat in a place called Lecompton. You could see it right here in the middle of Kansas. And they decided that Lecompton would be the center of Kansas, the center meaning not necessarily the geographic center, although it's pretty close, but just where the capital was going to be, temporary capital. Because they were the first ones there, they set up things and they set up a vote right away. And the interesting thing about it is the vote for whether or not Kansas was going to be free or slave, no matter how you voted on it, slavery was still going to be legal. The ironic thing about this is that there weren't very many slaves in the Kansas territory. Don't think for one second that big slave owners from, say, South Carolina were going to take their 100 slaves and they were going to rush to Kansas to influence the vote. They're not doing that. They're making their money in South Carolina, and they're not really interested in moving to Kansas, where it was questionable whether you're going to be able to grow cotton or not. People didn't want to bring their slaves into what potentially could become a hostile territory, which it did become hostile. So the Southerners who were moving into Kansas were not slave owners. They were the ones who wanted to someday become slave owners and hope to make a lot of money doing that. They were the poorest people in the South that decided they're going to go get cheap land and try to start a plantation. So it was a rough group, no doubt about it. It became pro-slavery plus what they called free soilers that were moving into this area. So they squared off against each other, and it got, as you could imagine, bloody. When you think about Kansas, you might think about cornfields, something like that. You need wheat fields. A lot of wheat is grown in Kansas today. I love to think about, I'm thinking of the Kansas-Nebraska Act here as Nebraska football. Originally, I am from Omaha, and I'm a big fan of Nebraska football. Also, Nebraska, they're known as the Corn Huskers, so you see cornfields. But here's a guy who became a central figure in Kansas, and his name was John Brown. He believed that he was sent by God to free the slaves, and he was absolutely driven. He had mental illness in his family, and he, John Brown, was mentally ill as well. He was just obsessed with freeing the slaves. Some of the means, though, to free the slaves, he was willing to do anything and everything, including attacking a group of pro-slavery men at Pottawatomie Creek in Kansas and literally hacking them apart limb by limb, which is the Wild West at the time, so he was able to get away with it. But that was what he was willing to do. Now, later on, we'll talk about the raid on Harper's Ferry, where he eventually is captured and put to death, which helps bring on the Civil War as well. But he is a polarizing figure. He's a hero to many of the abolitionists at the time. I'm not sure everybody knew the extent that he was willing to go to free the slaves. But Pottawatomie Creek is a great example of his mindset there. Here, the Lecompton Constitution was what I was referring to a couple slides ago, and that was what the Constitution was called, that was supposedly voted on by the people of Kansas. The problem with it is, though, it's not a problem. The Free Soilers said, we're not going to vote on this thing, because no matter how we vote, slavery is still going to be legal. But they put it up for a vote anyway. So as you can imagine, it passed almost unanimously because the pro-slavery people were the only ones voting on it. The Free Soilers refused to vote on it. So they submitted the Lecompton Constitution to Congress for approval so that Kansas would become a slave territory, not ready to be a state yet. Well, the senator who came up with the idea of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, as you know, is Stephen Douglas from Illinois. Stephen Douglas took a look at the Lecompton Constitution and said, this is not what I meant by popular sovereignty in Kansas. And he ripped up the Lecompton Constitution and said, we're not even voting on this, which really upset Southerners. Southerners were furious at Stephen Douglas. At one point, Stephen Douglas was a hero to Southerners for offering them the potential to have one more slave state with his Kansas-Nebraska Act. They liked that. But then when he decides not to accept the Lecompton Constitution that was voted on for popular sovereignty and slavery in the Kansas Territory, he became an enemy to Southerners. This move will really affect history big time. Southerners not liking Stephen Douglas is going to make a huge difference in the presidential election of 1860, where he's going to lose to Abraham Lincoln. So anyway, I'll get to that. I don't want to jump too far ahead, but Stephen Douglas now becomes an enemy of the South when he tears up the Lecompton Constitution. The Civil War will start before Kansas could ever vote on this again or becomes a state. This was 1857, and the war starts in 1861. I want to talk about something that is unthinkable. I say that. I've oftentimes said it's unthinkable that a bloodshed at the Capitol, but we know. We're looking at it just happened last week, was the bloodshed at the Capitol right now that's going on before the inauguration. I've just kind of been taken aback right now as I'm talking about this, that that how times have changed and how shocking what occurred at the Capitol last week, how big that is. And but anyway, Preston Brooks, this happened in 1856. Preston Brooks, who was from South Carolina, beat Charles Sumner, who was a Northerner, anti-slavery support. He was a supporter of abolitionism, one of the few in Congress, because it was such a controversial a controversial topic that there weren't many abolitionists, and he happened to be one of them. And Preston Brooks from South Carolina didn't like the rhetoric coming out of Sumner, and he got up and beat him over the head with a cane until Sumner was unconscious, and he laid on the floor. Other senators were watching this and refused to jump in and stop this fight from happening. Sumner was seriously injured. It took him years to recover because he had serious head injuries. And Brooks, believe it or not, was a hero in the South for doing this. Later on, he's expelled from the Senate because of it. Sumner later came back, but 3 years later, came back to the Senate. But this just goes to show you how brutal, how bloody, how divisive things are getting here on the Senate floor, in Congress, at the Capitol building, which you're seeing that happen right now. Sadly, you're seeing that happen in 2021. So anyway, here's a cane, a gold-headed cane that was sent to Preston Brooks by somebody, because they thought he was a hero. So pretty sad what's going on at this point. Let's talk about the election of 1856, but we really can't talk about the election of 1856 until we talk about the creation of the brand new Republican Party. The Republican Party came into existence in 1854, 2 years before this election. So it's the first ever presidential election for this party. The Republican Party replaced the Whig Party, which faded into oblivion. It was never really a solid party anyway. I say that, but then I also understand that two presidents were chosen. They were both war heroes without much political experience, and both died in office. Not that dying in office is a reason why they died out. Just the fact that they were just a party with the people with different ideas. They were all over the place, to say the least. But this new Republican Party emerges, and it's a lot of Whigs that were formerly National Republicans, which were before that formerly Federalist. So you could kind of look back at what the history of this party. The goal of the Republican Party now is to stop the spread of slavery. They wanted to make it clear that they were not an abolitionist party, because they knew if they came out and said they were an abolitionist party that they would get zero support from the South. As it is, they will get zero support from the South, but they also wanted to make sure they got some border state support too, those states that were right along the border between the North and the South. The first Republican candidate for president was a man by the name of John C. Fremont, who was, they called him the Pathfinder of the West. He traveled all throughout the West and, was an explorer. And he locally here, you might have heard about Fremont's Peak. You could just see it, right? You can get to Fremont's Peak by going almost getting by San Juan Bautista. Fremont's Peak is visible here in Salinas, and it's named after John C. Fremont because he explored that territory. So brand new Republican Party. The Democrats choose a man by the name of James Buchanan, who was untainted by the controversial Kansas-Nebraska Act. You can only imagine how controversial this Kansas-Nebraska Act has become, how divisive it has become for the Democrats. Originally, the Transcontinental Railroad was being built, and that was great, but this whole slavery issue is exploding at this time. James Buchanan was a foreign diplomat, so he was out of the country when this went on. So he seemed to be the perfect guy to pick to run in 1856. There was a racist party because of the influx of so many Irish at the time and Catholics. The Know Nothing Party started by a racist. They picked Millard Fillmore, former President Millard Fillmore. They're against immigration. They're against Catholics. They're against anybody coming into this country. So it was a reaction to all the immigrants coming in. So Know Nothing Party. So here's the outcome of this. Interestingly enough, the Know Nothing Party is one of the few parties, there's been some, but third parties in history to win electoral votes. One of the most successful, not the most, but one of the most successful third parties in American history. So we have a history of racism in this country. I'm not saying anything that you don't already know. We talk about it a lot these days, but Millard Fillmore actually wins, 8 electoral votes, 3%. And 874,000 or 22% of the popular vote. But the winner here in this election is James Buchanan, defeating John C. Fremont. Fremont didn't have much political experience, and the Republican Party is brand new as reasons why he was able to defeat him. Here's John C. Fremont there, how the exploring that he did. Buchanan's victory. Here's why Buchanan wins this election. One, as I said, the Republicans are a brand new party. 2, no political experience. I also said that. But here's the other one. Number 3 would be the start of the Civil War. Northerners refused to vote for Fremont because Southerners said if ever a Republican were elected president, they would secede from the Union. And if the South seceded from the Union, everybody knew what would happen next, and that would be civil war. So understand that Buchanan is benefited by the Southerners who said, hey, if any Republican wins, they would leave the Union. And sure, true to their word, when the first Republican is elected 4 years later, that would be Abraham Lincoln. That's when the South seceded right after that. And here's an interesting thought. It was a good thing for the country that Fremont was not elected. War would have started, and John C. Fremont would have been president, and most believe Fremont would have been in over his head as president during a civil war, and it could have been really ugly. Lincoln handled the Civil War way better than Fremont would have been able to. So we'll talk about how brilliant some of the things that Lincoln did before, during, and after the war. Not long after the war, because he died shortly thereafter, but he was planning the peace before his death. And the other thing too is that between 1856 and 1860, many things happened to help inflame and stir the passions of the North so that they would fight this war to the bloody end. And one of the things that happened during that time that upset Northerners enough to fight this thing to the bloody end and really got them really fired up was the Dred Scott case. Dred Scott was a slave who lived in a free territory. He was formerly in a slave territory. I believe it was Missouri, and then the owner moved nearby to another nearby state, Illinois, but Illinois was free territory. When Dred Scott's owner died, Dred Scott sued for his freedom based on the fact that he was in a free territory at the time. He was obviously passed down to the heirs of his owner, and that's why he was still enslaved. The Dred Scott case got all the way to the Supreme Court, where the Chief Justice of the United States, a Southerner from Kentucky, a guy by the name of Roger B. Taney, said this: a slave cannot bring suit in a federal court because a slave is not a citizen of the United States. He said, however, we are going to rule on it anyway. And Roger B. Taney, the Chief Justice of the United States, said that a slave is the owner, is the property of its owner, and an owner could bring his property wherever the owner wants to bring his property. What a shocking decision. Basically, what this decision said was that slavery was opened up everywhere in the United States. What's to keep someone from moving? Not that they would, but they could. A Southern plantation owner move up to New York or something and bring all of his 100 slaves with him. He could do that if he wanted to. Not that he would, as I said, because there's not money to be cotton brought in more than, say, if you were going to grow wheat or something in New York. So, yeah, slavery was opened up everywhere. So any act that was passed, including like the Missouri Compromise that outlawed slavery in Maine, you can now have slaves in Maine, I guess. The Northwest Ordinance goes all the way back to during the Articles of Confederation that said slavery was illegal in the Northwest Territory, any of those future states like Ohio and Illinois and Indiana. You can have slaves there now, according to the Dred Scott case. Kansas-Nebraska Act, why do you even have to vote on anything anymore? Basically, it just opened up slavery everywhere, and this upset the South. And they were really upset about this, obviously, just wanting to right this wrong. Here's Dred Scott, and there's Roger B. Taney. Taney looks like a happy guy, huh? But yeah, that's where we're at. That's part 1 of chapter 19.